Shalom. All right, a little different setup this week. We are in the house for the heat, so I won't be jumping around and getting all excited like I do sometimes. Although I think this is a very exciting topic that we're going to study. Everybody loves genealogy, right? Right, Brother Melech? You don't love genealogy? Oh, not everybody does. Okay. I was going to say, you know, I had a nice long talk about genealogy yesterday. Okay, so we're in chapter 10 of Genesis. Everybody will turn there. If they're not already there, they should be there. All right. Beginning in chapter 10 of Genesis, we're going to read about the descendants of Noah after the flood. We're going to cross a long period of time in a few verses. When we teach Genesis line for line all the way through as a college class, and when we do it for Armor of Light and go really deep into everything, we actually call the class the first half of human history, because if you sit down and you count the generations, that's what it is. Okay, and we're only 20% of the way through it when we get done with this 10th chapter, but we will have crossed thousands of years of human history if you sit down and count it, because of the lifespans. So it starts off in verse 1. It says, "These are the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavin, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras." Now there's some names right there that are very kind of jump out at us, okay? Because we're going to read them other places in Scripture later on. Like Gomer here shares a name. Gomer is a son, it says, but he shares a name with the wife of Hosea. Okay, so we now know where Hosea's wife got her name. Okay, that there was a recognition in the tables of the genealogy that was a name, an early name from after the flood. Magog. Scripture tells us that in the last days there will be the war of Gog and Magog. Okay, so by identifying who Magog is, and there's different opinions on that. Some people think it's China. Some people think it's the old Soviet Union going to rise again. Some people think it's the old Roman Empire going to rise again, which has pretty much happened in Europe now. But Gog and Magog will fight. So if we can identify who Magog is and who his descendants are, that's really what we should be trying to do when we're trying to figure out who Magog the nation is. Because the nations tend to always have the name of an ancestor. Okay, the Canaanites in the land of Canaan descended from a man named Canaan, right? Okay, and we see that pattern, and we're going to see more of it throughout this lesson. So Madai, I'm not 100% sure who that is. I have theories. Yavin or Javan, as they put it here. That most scholars that I've read believe that is the ancestor of the far eastern Orientals, and that this is actually the root of the name Japan. Okay, now they don't call themselves Japanese; they have their own name for it, for themselves. But Most other nations refer to them as being Japanese. Okay, and there's only one letter difference here. And if you look at Paleo Hebrew, there's really not much, even that much difference. There is kind of a blurring of the sound, um, and you end up with Japhan. Um, Tubal, Meshach. We see Meshach's name appear later on in the book of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Okay, so whether that's a direct ancestor or not, I really don't know. But again, just like with the name Gomer, we see that they're going back. We see the beginning of a pattern here. Just like my son Jacob is named after my grandfather, who was named after his uncle, who was named after, and it just keeps on going back. And then my great grandfather on the other side was also had the same name. Okay, I'm named after my great great uncle, and so, I mean, we see that beginning here, and we see that people, as the families were spreading out, I think part of what we're seeing here is a a desire that even though they're spreading out and becoming different clans, different nations, there's a desire to remember that they're all related, or they wouldn't be sharing those names interchangeably as much. I think that's a very important. Um, Brother Drummond, if you ever go to Sighted Moon Ministry, go to their website. They've got some fantastic teachings he's done on the so-called lost tribes of Israel, and he talks about how the names are so important and how they interlink, and how and he talks about the heraldry of the Israelim, and how you can go anywhere in the world, and if someone has true heraldry that you can trace back to the Isles, um, you can look at the insignias and know what immediately whether or not they have Israelite blood. Okay, I mean, I can get the book out on my wife's family history. I can open it up. I can show you the heraldry, and there is no way to debate it. She is of the tribe of Judah, of Yahudim. Um, and I think that that's part of what we see here is the beginning of that, as the passing down of these names, so people don't forget who's related to who. The descendants of Gomer, Ashkenaz. I wonder why that name would be important to everyone in this room. Could it be because we are all Ashkenazi Yahudim, right? You all have heard us talk about that. We're not Sephardi. We're not, we're not all these other different types of Yahudim. We are specifically Ashkenazi. Okay. Now, was this Ashkenaz right here the Ashkenaz that we are descended from, or that led the group that settled the Germanic states, um, put the Israeli colonies there? No, but this is where his name came from. Okay, so there's a recognition there of an interconnectedness. Riphath and Togarmah, the descendants of Yavin, Elisha, and Tarshish. We talk about Tarshish going down to the sea. Okay, so we see a son of Yavin, which we believe is Japan. Okay, going down to the sea. So we see the beginnings of that migration. The Kittim and the Doadim. From these, the maritime nations branched out. These are the descendants of Japheth by their lands, each with its language, their clans, and their nations. Okay, so this is an important thing. We talk about there's 12 tribes in Yisrael, but there are 72 nations that will gather in the last days. Okay, and we're not talking about the however many countries there are in the world, because that's way more than 72. But if you look at them and you start grouping them by language, it comes out, most scholars say, anywhere from 70 to 74 I think it's exactly 72. I think they don't want to say 72 because then they would have to admit that Scripture is right. But there will be 72 nations that gather to give glory and recognize that we all came from the same place. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So we knew that Canaan from previous weeks. We knew that Canaan was a son of Ham, right? And we knew that he was cursed for learning the sin of Ham, and that if he carried it on, he would be worse than Ham. And we've studied on that why Noach would say, "Cursed be Canaan," when Ham was actually the one who did him wrong. We've had that talk. Very rarely do I hear anybody talk about. In fact, I'm the only person I've ever heard preach it. Canaan had an older brother named Mizraim. Where else does Mizraim show up in Scripture? Mizraim is the root word, or I shouldn't say the root, it's the original word in the Hebraic text for when in the English when they say Egypt. Okay? Now, I've been saying in these other instances, they just borrowed the name to remind them people were interconnected and what have you. This, from what I can understand, is actually an ancestor of the original Mizraim. When it became a nation, the nation that eventually held Israel in captivity, that this was their ancestor. He descended from Ham. He was an older brother of Canaan. We also see here about Put and Lud, who draw the bow. Remember talking about that in those prophecies? Okay. So we start to see how these peoples break up, and when we talk about Put and Lud, we're talking about people groups that are descended from Ham. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteca. The descendants of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. So, where is Sheba and where is Dedan? We talk later about the Queen of Sheba, who comes up and eventually becomes part of the royal court and misleads a king named Solomon. Okay, who actually a lot of scholars think that the Queen of Sheba may have been the woman he was speaking to in the Song of Solomon. That's debated. I'm not going to sit here and say that it is, but I think it makes a lot of sense because some of the descriptions of her in that song. But here we see Sheba, and we know that Sheba was where, or is where. It's in Africa. It's not the whole continent of Africa. It's not even like some people try to associate it to like the country of South Africa. I'm not even saying it was that, but it was somewhere in Africa. And all of our historical sources seem to point to that, and so was Dedan. Cush also begot Nimrod, and here's where it gets really interesting. And here's where we have to have the discussion, because if we don't have the discussion here today, you won't be able to have this discussion with the Gentiles who try to draw you into their customs. It says Cush begot Nimrod. So we're still talking about the sons of Ham. So Nimrod would be, I guess, the grandson of Ham, who was the first man of might on the earth. Okay, was he the first man of might, or was he the first one after the flood? I think he was the first one after the flood, because there were Nephilim prior to the flood. So he may have been the first, what they considered a mighty man who was a pure man. And that may be what part of what led to what happens with him later on. Um, it says he was a mighty hunter by the grace of Yehovah. Okay, hence the saying. Now, usually when I talk about Nimrod, I have a trouble saying anything good about him because of what becomes of his situation. Today, when we say someone is a Nimrod, we mean they're an idiot. Okay, um, we don't mean that they're a mighty hunter. Okay, and I think the reason that has come down to is that a Nimrod is an idiot probably has to do with the fact that he was blessed of Yehovah and then allowed the things that happened to happen. Okay, he became arrogant, he became conceited. Um, he demanded that we know this from extra biblical texts. He demanded his people worship him, and then he died, and his wife made things even worse. The mainstays of his kingdom were Babylon. Oh, now we're coming down close to home, aren't we? We're talking about Babylon in the later study. Iraq, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Okay, so one of the mainstays of his kingdom was Babylon, and that's important because Babylonian mythology is where we hear the most about Nimrod, because Nimrod, when he died, supposedly ascended into the heavens according to their pagan customs, their beliefs, and became Baal, became the sun god that they worship. His wife, Ashtaroth, had a son. It was kind of an embarrassing situation for her because her husband had already been dead for quite a while. There was no biological way that he could have been Nimrod's son. And so she came up with this story about how in the springtime, when the sun came back, the rays of that sunlight impregnated her, and she became pregnant with, or gave birth to, a son whose name was Tammuz. Now, we're getting close to home again because in our other study, we're talking about the pagan rites of Tammuz, right? About the 25 men worshiping the sun instead of bowing to the temple, and the women were weeping for Tammuz. Okay, it's all starting to come together now, isn't it? Because what happened? What did I tell you in that study happened to Tammuz? Tammuz was a great hunter, like his father. Well, like who she said was his father. Okay, he went out into the wilderness. He was hunting. He got gored by a wild boar. He was dying, and according to Babylonian mythology, being half god. See how the enemy turns that around? You see how you get the Babylonian half god mythology wrapped into Messiah in the modern church? How they incorporate that and try to make him something he's not rather than glorifying what he is? So he is gored by this boar and he's dying, and supposedly he sees a bird. Doesn't much like birds, but he loves rabbits, and he uses his last little bit of power that he has as a half god who is dying and turns the bird into a rabbit. But his power was weak, and he didn't turn it completely into a rabbit, and so the rabbit that he created went around laying eggs. Now, to put this all together, Ashtaroth made herself the high priestess of this new cultic pagan mystery religion, and she says that on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, Everyone who is a part of her religion and worships her husband Nimrod Baal, or Baal Nimrod, however you want to put it. I think it's actually properly Baal Nimrod. Anyone who worships him is part of her religion and honors her son Tammuz as she ordered them to. On the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, they would gather for her high feast, the feast of Astaroth, also called Astarte, also called Eostra, if you come through the Germanic languages later, also called Easter today, and it's still on that same day, that you would gather, you would kill a wild boar, that's where they get the Easter ham, and that what they would do as a fertility rite, they would take children who had been born. The priests of her religion would rape virgins on the altar of Tammuz in the springtime, and they would impregnate them, and they would give birth up late in December, right around December 25th, which just happened to be the date of Tammuz's birth. And they would be consecrated 3 months later. They would be sprinkled with water, like most mainline churches today do what they call a so-called baptism of the infant. And how many of them do it on quote-unquote Easter Sunday, Astaroth's day? And then they would sacrifice those children that they had consecrated on the same altar where their mothers were impregnated. And they would dip eggs as a sign of fertility into that blood in the hopes of bringing fertility to the earth and a good crop the coming year. Do we understand why it's important that we know the names and where they come from, and that we don't just gloss over the genealogy? Because I guarantee you there's not a church in this town or almost in this county. I think there are 2 other places in this county where you could go and hear this actually taught to some degree. In general, this is not even taught because the churches have pushed it under the rug. But if it's taught, it's not taught in context and it's glossed over. From that land, Ashur went forth and built Nineveh. Holy cow. Nineveh, a Gentile city, one of 2 places, or actually one place, I'm sorry, it's the one Gentile city that got 2 prophets sent to it. And the first time everyone repented, and the prophet said, why don't you go ahead and destroy it? And Elohim basically told him it wasn't his business. And the second time, nobody listened. And that's a very, very dark chapter in the history of that region. So now we know Ashur built Nineveh. He also built Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Risen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Now, Nineveh was it 3 days it took him to walk across in the sunshine, in the daylight? It was a metropolis. And yet it says here that Calah is the great city. Okay? So whatever Nineveh was, Calah was bigger. And people laugh at me when I say I think that the technology pre-flood was probably way, way above what modern archaeology recognizes, okay, or what they allow us to see. They may recognize it and just not reveal it. I think there was enough of a remnant of understanding of that had been passed down from Noah's sons to their sons and grandsons and great grandsons, that there was almost immediately a resurgence of building of cities. Okay, we also see that the human population was just exploding at this time. Okay, because we're a few generations from the flood, and there are mighty cities being built. And Mizraim, back to Egypt, or the ancestor of Egypt, of the Egyptians, begot the Ludim. Okay, begot the Lud. Remember Hut and Lud we talked about. Okay, so whoever Lud is, and we'll study that in another study sometime. When whoever Lud is, you remember Lud then is a cousin to or some sort of ancestor, one or the other, to the Egyptians. I believe his descendants were cousins to the Egyptians. The Anamim, the Lehabim, the Naphtahim, the Pathrazim, the Kazlahim, and the Raphtarim, whence the Philistines came forth. Now, how significant is that? Lud, that we hear about making war against Israel. Mitzrayim, which held Israel captive for over 400 years. And the Philistines all come from the same bloodline. They're cousins. And as much as we were told, go into the land, wipe everybody out, but don't touch these people because they're your distant cousins. They're sons of Abraham. They're sons of Yitzhak. They're sons of Jacob. Don't harm them. How much do you think that these nations that knew that when it's in their genealogy, they know that they're descended from the same son of Noah? How much do you think that they banded together when they came against us? Supported them, each other. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn. Remember we talked about the king of Sidon? We wondered, how is the king of Sidon? It's this pagan nation, but why does he not want the punishment given to the uncircumcised? I believe it's because somebody who was Yitzhak came in and took over, was raised up in the court, so to speak, and became the leader of the nation. His firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Wow. So about half of those were people that we battled for the Holy Land. Afterward, the clans of Canaan of the Canaanites spread out. Now, the next line I'm going to read you is a double redactical statement. The redactical statement that was inserted says the Canaanite territory extended from Sidon so now we understand the connection. How could it be that a son of Jacob, or a descendant of Jacob, became king of Sidon? Well, they were next door neighbors. As far as Gerar, near Gaza, and as far as Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, near Lasha. Now, you recognize any of those names? Sodom, Gomorrah. Interesting how they also descend from Canaan. The two most evil places in the history of the world descend from the son who was cursed for repeating his father's sin, because his descendants continued to increase in their sin. The double redactical statement is that somebody, I think it's the JPS editors, went into the redactical statement and put in another redaction, and it says the original Canaanite territory. In other words, they didn't own all of that territory when we took it. These are the descendants of Ham according to their clans and languages by their lands and nations. Sons were also born to Shem, ancestor of all the descendants of Eber and older brother of Japheth. The descendants of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram, Uz. Oh, wait. There was a man in the land of Uz. Does anybody remember hearing that? I don't know, 20 some weeks ago when Yaakov was teaching on it? Hol, Gether, and Mash. Arphaxad begot Shelah, and Shelah begot Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the first was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And the name of his brother was Joktan. Joktan begot Almadad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abimiel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the descendants of Joktan. Now, we see again some sharing of names. Okay, so there's still a recognition that even though they're spreading out over the earth, they're the same blood. And that's something that's been lost in our modern racist mindset. Okay, people shy away from caring for or helping people of other races, other so-called ethnicities. There's only one race. It's the human race. There's only one blood. It's the blood of Adam. Okay, and if we forget that, then we're missing not the entire, but a huge degree, the lesson of this passage. But I want to back up for a second. And it says, Peleg had his name, for in his days the earth was divided. Peleg literally means to divide or to break apart. Okay? People have tried to say that this was when, quote unquote, Pangea broke up. This is the beginning of plate tectonics. And I really think, although I believe that all is real, I believe that there was a single landmass originally. I think scripture says it and science points to it. I believe it broke up over time. I believe plate tectonics is going on. Okay. What I do not believe is that this is when it started. I believe that started at the time of the flood, not several generations after it. I believe that when it talks about Peleg being named that because the nation or because the world was divided, the earth was divided, I believe they're talking about mankind became divided, and we're going to read about that in an upcoming chapter when we read about what happened at Babel. Their settlements extended from Mesha as far as Sephar, the hill country to the east. These are the descendants of Shem, according to their clans and languages, by their lands, according to their what? Their nations, not their countries, and we've talked about that before, but I want to reiterate it. Their nations, not their countries. I am not of the American nation. I am of the nation of Yisrael. My country is the United States of America. Okay? It's two totally different things. Your nation is your bloodline, your heritage. Your country is the state, so to speak, in which the political entity under which you live. okay, and within the boundaries of which you were born. That's your country. Your nation is where your blood comes from. And it's important as Yisraelim and Yehudim that we remember what nation really means, or we will lose our identity again. These are the groupings of Noach's descendants according to their origins by their nations, and from these the nations branched out over the earth after the flood. Okay? And from these are where the 72 nations are going to come when we get to Babel upcoming.